Karoline Leavitt was just wrapping up a town hall when a little girl, barely 9 years old, raised her hand and asked one simple question about God. What followed wasn't a political answer. It was something deeper, something real. And in a time where faith is mocked, families are fractured, and truth feels rare, Karoline's response reminded everyone watching what still matters most. This is the moment that stopped the room. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss one. Okay, let's get into it. It was the last stop of the week. Karoline Leavitt had been on the road for 10 days, 6 town halls, for interviews, and more late-night fast food than she cared to admit. The venue was modest, a small evangelical church just off a quiet county road, built decades ago by farmers and factory workers. Rows of folding chairs lined the fellowship hall. A plywood cross stood behind her, nailed to the wall above the modest platform where she now stood. The crowd was what you'd expect. Hardworking Americans, mostly older, mostly quiet. They weren't here for fanfare. They were here for answers. Karoline had just finished fielding a question about school choice when an older woman in the front row raised her hand. She was holding the hand of a little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, clutching a worn pink Bible. "My granddaughter has something she'd like to ask," the woman said softly. The room turned. Karoline smiled. Of course. The mic was passed down row by row until it landed in the girl's tiny hands. She looked nervous, her fingers wrapped around the base of the microphone like it might break. She glanced up at her grandmother, who gave her a reassuring nod. And then she spoke. "Do you think God still hears us, even when bad people run everything?" You could hear a pin drop. Karoline stood frozen, not from shock, but from the weight of the moment. She had debated governors. She'd stood toe-to-toe with pundits on cable news, sparred with elite journalists, and faced down hecklers in college auditoriums. But nothing had ever pierced the room like that one question from one little girl. She stepped down from the stage slowly, carefully, the wooden floor creaking beneath her heels. She knelt in front of the girl, now eye to eye, and for a few seconds, she said nothing, because sometimes the pause says more than the reply. Then, finally, Karoline placed her hand gently on the girl's arm and said, "I think that's the bravest question anyone has asked me all year." The girl smiled faintly, but her eyes stayed serious. The room was so quiet, even the old HVAC unit seemed to hold its breath. Karoline looked up, scanning the crowd. Not as a politician, but as a daughter, as someone who had grown up praying those same words. "God, are you still there?" She turned back to the girl, and just before she spoke again, something flickered across her face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was grief. The kind you carry for years and never speak about until the exact right moment comes. And in that moment, she decided to share it. With her. With everyone. Not for applause, but because the truth deserved a voice. And what she said next would leave that little girl in tears. Karoline didn't rush her reply. She knelt there in the aisle, eye to eye with a little girl holding a pink Bible and the weight of the world in one simple question. All the cameras in the back of the room, all the notepads from the press, suddenly didn't matter. The politics faded. The schedule vanished. This wasn't a campaign moment. It was sacred. Karoline looked at the girl, then at the crowd, and said quietly, "I used to ask that question too." There was a murmur. Nothing disruptive, just the sound of grown adults shifting in their chairs, caught off guard by a tone they hadn't heard in a long time. Sincerity. "My family went through something really hard when I was just a few years older than you," she said. It was a Tuesday morning when the call came. My dad had collapsed at work. Heart failure. No warning. She paused. Her throat caught, just slightly, but she didn't break. I remember praying that night. Begging, really. I asked God to make it a mistake. To wake me up. To give me some kind of sign that he was still there. That he was still listening. The room was still as glass. Karoline glanced at the girl again, her voice softening. And when nothing happened, when the house stayed quiet and the ambulance didn't come back, I started to think maybe he wasn't listening. The girl's lip trembled. Karoline didn't avert her eyes. She leaned closer. "I know how scary it feels when the world doesn't seem fair. When people lie. When bad things happen. When leaders make rules that hurt families like yours and mine. And I know how easy it is to think that God's just stopped paying attention. Then, for the first time, her voice cracked. But I'm here, right now, not because God abandoned me. I'm here because he carried me. The little girl's eyes were brimming with tears. Karoline placed her hand gently on hers. He doesn't always shout, she said. Sometimes he whispers. Sometimes he shows up in the arms of the people who hold you when you cry. Sometimes he's in the words of a friend. And sometimes he sent a little girl to remind a whole room what faith really means. At that, the little girl's tears fell. Silently, without drama. Just raw, beautiful emotion. Karoline wiped one from her cheek. And the answer to your question, she said, is yes. God hears you. He always has. Even when we don't hear him back right away. The girl threw her arms around Karoline's neck. The crowd stood without being asked. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was reverence. Because Karoline hadn't just answered a question. She answered the question and reminded a room full of forgotten people that God wasn't done with them yet. No one in the church that night was thinking about social media. No one reached for their phones during Karoline's answer. The room had been too still, too reverent, too sacred to cheapen with a screen. But in the back, unnoticed, was a young volunteer from a local conservative news outlet, live streaming the town hall from a fixed camera. He hadn't planned on catching anything viral, but what he recorded would shatter every algorithm. By the time Karoline and the little girl hugged, the stream had less than 200 viewers. But by the time Karoline stepped outside, wiped her eyes, and quietly thanked the pastor, the video had already been clipped by a Christian parenting page on Facebook. Then a youth pastor in Georgia reposted it. Then a veteran group in Tennessee. Then a Catholic high school teacher in Wisconsin sent it to every parent in her mailing list with the subject line, "This is what our girls need to see." Within 3 hours, it had 1.2 million views. But it wasn't just the reach, it was the reaction. One mother commented, "I showed this to my daughter. She cried too. She asked if Karoline could be her big sister." Another wrote, "My son asked me why no one on TV talks about God like that anymore. I didn't have an answer." The comments section became a digital altar. Prayer requests, Bible verses, confessions, testimonies. The clip had opened something, and not just online. Cable news didn't know how to respond. Fox played the clip during prime time with reverent commentary. MSNBC tried to ignore it. CNN labeled it emotional exploitation. But even their anchors looked uncomfortable reading the headline. Because the truth was too plain. There was no spin to be had. It wasn't a political stunt. It wasn't a press gimmick. It was just one little girl. One honest question. And one woman who had the courage to answer it with her whole heart. The ripple didn't stop there. Churches across the country played the clip during Sunday service. Youth groups held discussion nights around it. One Christian college in the Midwest printed out the transcript and taped it to the student chapel wall with the words, "God still hears." Even skeptics couldn't deny the impact. A well-known atheist blogger posted the video with the caption, "I don't agree with her faith, but I've never seen someone speak to a child like that with such sincerity." Maybe that's what's missing in our politics and our culture. Meanwhile, Karoline said nothing. No reposts, no press tour, no monetization. She stayed silent, just as she had at the town hall, because the moment wasn't about her. But the country couldn't stop talking. Because in a world choking on outrage and division, one quiet moment of faith had cut through the noise. And the ripples were only beginning to reach the shore. It didn't take long. As the video continued to surge, 10 million views by day 2, headlines across conservative media, and invitations pouring in from churches nationwide, the backlash began. Not from the people, from the machine. The mainstream press had tried to ignore it, hoping the moment would vanish like most viral clips. But it didn't vanish. It grew. And with each new wave of support, with every parent, pastor, and patriot sharing Karoline's answer, the gatekeepers got nervous. That's when the hit pieces started. Faith-based manipulation. Karoline Leavitt's town hall performance raises questions. Politician uses child's pain to push Christian agenda. Too polished to be real? Experts doubt Leavitt's emotional moment was spontaneous. They didn't dare quote her directly, because the words were too sincere, too unimpeachable. Instead, they attacked her motive. Editorials accused her of staging the encounter. Twitter threads popped up suggesting the girl was a plant. One influencer wrote, "Notice how the camera just happened to be rolling? Never mind that the live stream had been public. Never mind that the girl was a local church member with no political connections. None of it mattered to the narrative factory." And then it got uglier. A popular progressive commentator suggested Karoline's response was emotional grooming, claiming that invoking God's silence in front of a crying child was theocratic manipulation. Another viral thread accused her of pushing faith-based trauma conditioning. Suddenly, Karoline was no longer just a young conservative who had answered a child with grace. She was, according to the left, a threat. A threat because she didn't back down. A threat because she didn't get angry. A threat because she reminded the nation that faith didn't need to yell to be powerful. Karoline stayed silent for 2 days. Then, quietly, she accepted a live interview with a local radio host in her home district. Nothing flashy, no makeup team, no PR handler. Just her, a microphone, and a simple message. "I didn't plan that moment, and I didn't speak for cameras. I spoke to a child, because I remember what it feels like to wonder if God hears you. And I'd rather be mocked by every pundit in D.C. than stay silent when a little girl asks me where he's gone." It was calm, measured, devastating. Clips from that interview went viral too. Not because she was fighting, but because she refused to. No rage, no name-calling, no spin, just truth. And that made the critics even angrier. Because every attempt to twist the moment, to tarnish it, to turn it into a controversy, fell flat. Even some liberal voices began to retreat. One podcaster admitted, "Maybe we should just let a kid's question be a kid's question." But the damage was done for them, because in trying to smear Karoline, they'd only amplified the original moment. And more Americans were now asking the same thing that little girl did. Does God still hear us? And thanks to Karoline's answer, millions knew the truth again. The pushback had been loud, nasty, predictable. But what came next? It was louder in the quietest way imaginable. Letters, hundreds of them, handwritten notes in blue ink, crayon drawings from Sunday school classes, postcards from tiny towns Karoline had never visited. And every one of them said the same thing in their own way. "We saw what happened, and we felt something we haven't felt in years." There was the single mom in West Virginia who wrote, "I haven't stepped in a church in a decade, but when I saw how you answered that little girl, I got on my knees and prayed for the first time in years." There was the Vietnam veteran from Indiana who scribbled on the back of a diner napkin, "That clip reminded me why I fought. Not for parties, for people like her, and people like you." And there was a letter from a teacher in a public school in Minnesota. "I played your response for my 5th graders. We talk about what faith means when the world feels heavy." One student cried and said, "I didn't know adults could talk like that." Karoline read every single one, alone, in silence. No camera crew, no staff filtering the mail. She sat at her kitchen table late into the night, reading, weeping, praying. This wasn't campaign energy. It wasn't media buzz. It was something deeper. It was a reawakening. Something she hadn't planned. Something she hadn't dared to hope for. Something God had clearly orchestrated. Requests started coming in. Not from pundits. Not from politicians. From pastors. Would she come speak to their youth group? Could she record a message for their church? Could she visit their community? Not to talk about elections. Not to debate culture wars. To talk about faith. About loss. About hearing God in the quiet. And every time Karoline was asked, she gave the same answer. "Yes, if it's for the children, I'll come." Soon, clips of Karoline praying with kids in gymnasiums, kneeling beside parents at candlelight vigils, and visiting nursing homes quietly surfaced online. None of it was staged. Most of it wasn't even filmed by her team. People were sharing these moments because they meant something. Because somewhere along the way, America had stopped seeing public figures talk about God without apology or performance. And now they were seeing it again. Not from a pastor, not from a televangelist, from a young woman who simply told the truth to a little girl with a pink Bible and meant every word. For the first time in years, people weren't just asking questions about faith. They were living it. Small Bible study groups started up across college campuses, some from students who saw the clip and said, "I want what she has." One church in Florida called it the Leavitt moment. But Karoline didn't care what they named it. She just knew one thing. God had used a little girl's question to wake up a sleeping country. And the country was starting to remember what it meant to believe again. The invitations kept coming, but one stood out. It arrived in a plain white envelope. No logo, no grand seal, just a handwritten note in sharp cursive addressed to Karoline Leavitt, personal. Inside was a letter from the organizers of the National Faith and Freedom Forum, an annual gathering of spiritual leaders, cultural influencers, and a few carefully chosen public servants. It wasn't televised. It wasn't tweeted. It was private on purpose. The letter read, "We've never invited a non-clergy speaker to headline Sunday morning. Until now, we believe God is using you, and we think the country needs to hear what you said to that little girl on a national stage." Karoline sat with the letter in her lap, motionless. It was an honor, yes, but it was something else too, a turning point, because this wasn't just about being heard. This was about stepping fully into a role she hadn't campaigned for, becoming a voice, not just for conservatives or voters or the next generation, but for something far bigger, a voice for faith. She took a day to think. She fasted. She prayed. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning, she stood in front of the most influential faith leaders in the country, not at a podium, but at a wooden pulpit under a simple cross. She wore no political badge, no earpiece, no stylist, just a modest dress, a Bible in one hand, and the memory of a little girl's question in her heart. She began without notes. A child asked me if God still hears us when bad people run everything. And I couldn't stop thinking about how many adults are secretly wondering the same thing. She paused. The truth is, we've traded reverence for rage, worship for worry, faith for fear. And somewhere along the way, we've forgotten that God does his best work when the world looks like it's falling apart. There were no shouts of amen, just heads bowed, tears quietly wiped away. He doesn't always come in fire, she said. Sometimes he comes as a whisper. Sometimes he comes as a question from a little girl in the front row of a town hall. And sometimes he comes with a reminder that we don't need perfect politicians. We need courageous believers. After she finished, the entire room stood in silence. Not in applause, not in spectacle, in conviction. The speech spread fast, not through viral clips this time, but through word of mouth. Pastors quoted her in sermons. Teachers used her words in devotionals. Grandmothers repeated her message around Sunday dinner tables. The headlines changed. Leavitt moves from candidate to messenger. Young woman's words ignite faith conversation nationwide. Not a campaign, a calling. That night, Karoline sat alone on her back porch with a journal in her lap. She wrote one sentence. "I don't know where this leads, but I know who leads it," because she understood now. The question wasn't whether she would accept the invitation. It was whether the rest of the country was ready to listen. And from everything she had seen, maybe, just maybe, it finally was. What began as a single question had now become something unstoppable. In the weeks following Karoline's speech at the Faith and Freedom Forum, something shifted in the national conversation. Not just politically, but spiritually. You could feel in the stories. In the small-town churches, seeing record attendance. In young women starting Bible studies at colleges where faith had long been mocked. In fathers gathering their children before bed to read Scripture again, not out of obligation but hope. And at the center of it all was one moment. One little girl. One quiet answer. Karoline didn't launch a nonprofit. She didn't hire a media firm or start a podcast. She did something rarer. She just kept showing up. No entourage. No agenda, just open hands and a willing heart. In Kansas, she spoke to a women's recovery group who saw her town hall clip and said it helped them believe God could forgive them, too. In Pennsylvania, she visited a rural school where a little boy whispered, "I think God used you to answer my prayer." In Texas, a pastor's wife said, "You reminded my husband why he started preaching in the first place." The national media, still confused, didn't know what to do. She didn't fit their box. She wasn't selling anything. She wasn't running for anything. She wasn't angry. She was faithful. And faith, real faith, not performative, not politicized, not commercial, was breaking through the noise. Even in D.C., you could feel the tremors. Members of Congress who mocked her just weeks earlier were now silent. Others leaned in, privately asking to pray with her, to understand what they'd witnessed. They weren't fans. They were hungry. Karoline kept the little girl's question written in her Bible. She read it before every speech, every interview, every prayer. Do you think God still hears us? And now, she had an answer that echoed far beyond that church. Yes. Yes, he does. He hears the widow crying alone after watching the country change. He hears the farmer praying over a collapsing economy. He hears the mother kneeling at her child's bedside, begging for hope. He hears the forgotten, the silenced, the faithful remnant. And in this moment, he used Karoline, not because she was famous, but because she was available. The story ended up on the cover of a national Christian magazine. The girl who reminded America that God still listens. But Karoline didn't read it. She was busy answering letters. And one, from the little girl, simply said, "Thank you. I know he hears me now." That was all the reward she needed. Because she hadn't built a campaign. She had sparked a movement. And it didn't carry slogans. It carried scripture. It carried compassion. It carried light into places where hope had been hiding. And now, because one little girl was brave enough to ask, and one woman was brave enough to answer, a nation was remembering how to believe again. If you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel.